Hi, I'm Robyn, founder of Empower Total Health, and welcome to the first weekly update for 2018. And this week I'm discussing reductionism and wholism in medical research. Now, reading medical journals, which I do very often, is generally a frustrating experience for me, as most articles are written from, unknowingly from the author's point of view. They emanate from this reductionist paradigm. Reductionism was defined by Professor T. Colin Campbell in the book that I consider his masterpiece, which is Whole, not the China Study. China Study is good, but Whole is really the masterwork. And Campbell defines reductionism in this book as the belief that everything in the world can be understood if you understand all its component parts. Campbell contrasts this with wholism, which is the belief that the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. Let me give you a practical example. You could analyse the nutritional components of an apple, and you could figure out that an apple has X many grams of fibre, and Y many grams of protein, Z many grams of carbohydrate or sugar, and this many milligrams of vitamin C or any other nutrient. And if you figure all of that out and then you got all of those components of the apple and you put them on the counter, would you have an apple? No, you'd have a pile of stuff, but you wouldn't have an apple. So the whole apple is greater than the sum of its parts. The parts don't define its appleness, if you like. However, reductionism is what has triumphed in medical research and practice, and it leads to the perspective that disease is simply a series of biochemical processes, and that can be interfered with, cured, by developing drugs that target aspects of these biochemical processes. Now, the concept of health, which actually derives from the Greek word holos, which means whole, so health, the word health relates to whole. This concept of health is just completely foreign to the reductionist perspective. Drugs treat disease. They don't and they can't restore health, because health is not merely the absence of the symptoms of disease or something going wrong biochemically. Health is a condition of the whole living body, and health arises naturally, spontaneously, inevitably, when all the various dimensions of the human owner of that body, physical, psychological, social, and spiritual, are functioning at their optimal level. In contrast to the reductionist perspective, a holistic perspective on disease seeks to understand how this particular disease developed in this particular person at this particular time, and how their particular body is attempting to restore itself to a state of health by manifesting symptoms. Once these particularities are understood, a holistic treatment plan can be tailored for the individual. A treatment plan that incorporates diet, lifestyle, prescriptions, and psychosocial factors also, all of which act synergistically to restore health, this state of wholeness. The January 9, 2018 edition of the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA as it's normally called, quite unintentionally I'm sure, contained a fascinating juxtaposition between the reductionist and the holistic viewpoints. Up the reductionist end of the spectrum, there was an article and an accompanying editorial which conveyed the sad news that the latest magic bullet for Alzheimer's disease, a drug called idalipidine, had failed miserably in 3 clinical trials. And it showed promise in the preclinical work, but when it came to actually putting it to the test, it was a complete catastrophe. But there was no apparent understanding by either the authors of the article or the author of the editorial of how utterly predictable this failure was, given that Alzheimer's disease is a complex chronic disease process that's primarily influenced by diet, lifestyle, and socioeconomic factors, including education level. After pointing out that, quote, medications approved for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease provide little symptomatic benefit, end quote, the author of the editorial, David Bennett, MD, opined that the rationale for the agent, the idalipidine, was sound because the brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease show pathological abnormalities in multiple neurotransmitter systems, and this particular drug has the potential to augment multiple neurotransmitter systems to improve cognition. So what he was saying is, we figured out that these biochemical things go wrong in Alzheimer's disease patients' brains. So if we have a drug that interferes with that, that will make them think clearly again. But then reality set in. As with the other 400 plus drugs that have been clinically trialled in Alzheimer's patients, the complete intellectual bankruptcy of the reductionist perspective that informed the development of idalipidine and other related drugs revealed itself yet again. On the whole, patients given a placebo, an inert substance with no therapeutic value, actually did better on measures of cognitive function than those given the drug. And given that another drug with a similar mechanism of action called interpidine has also failed to demonstrate any benefit in clinical trials that it's been subjected to, it looks like the end of the road for this particular class of drug. It looks like the drug companies are going to give up on developing this as the next boy wonder for Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Bennett, the editorialist, lamented that the lack of progress in the treatment and prevention of Alzheimer's disease is frustrating for patients, families, physicians, researchers, industry, funders, and policymakers. No doubt. But what's even more frustrating to me is the refusal to learn the obvious lessons from this lack of progress. Reductionism doesn't work. Instead of acknowledging the bleeding obvious, Bennett urges close study of the reasons for failure of the drugs trials so far, so that we can come up with better, more targeted drugs. Where have we heard that before? How anyone, let alone a highly educated person, could even have expected a drug to exert a clinically meaningful effect on a complex syndrome that is the cumulative result of factors such as undereducation in earlier life, followed by decades of poor dietary and lifestyle choices and a lack of intellectual stimulation, is really completely beyond me. As I mentioned in my article last year summarising the research of Drs. Aisha and Dean Sherzai, we need to grow up. We need to stop looking for magic bullets to save us from our bad habits, and we need to take an integrated approach to prevention and treatment of cognitive decline, an approach that incorporates a whole food plant-based diet, regular exercise, meditation, restful sleep, and cognitive stimulation. In other words, all the factors that have been shown to be protective against the development of Alzheimer's in the first place. Now, fortunately for me, just when I was on the verge of concluding that doctors must be the most well-educated stupid people on the planet, another editorial gave me hope that there are some signs of intelligent life in the profession after all. JAMA's senior editor, Philip Greenland MD, took a pretty clear-headed swing at the media outcry that's popped up in the US over new clinical practice guidelines for the prevention, detection, evaluation and management of high blood pressure in adults. He pointed out that those who criticised the guidelines for, quote, making too many individuals in the United States sick or labelling them with a disease, end quote, we're missing the obvious point that these people are sick, whether or not they have obvious signs of it as yet, and that the culprit is their diet and lifestyle. As Dr. Greenland quite boldly stated, the US way of life is the problem, not the guidelines. And don't fool yourself. The US way of life is not unique. We in Australia are stumbling down the same path to destruction as our American friends. But what a breath of fresh air it was to read such common sense in a medical journal. It's a rare experience. Greenland referred to a 2003 study which showed that 90% or more of people with myocardial infarction, that is heart attack, had been exposed to unfavourable levels of major cardiovascular risk factors before the onset of CHD, that's coronary heart disease. Importantly, unfavourable levels did not mean clinically high. Rather, simply levels above population ideal levels, which is a systolic blood pressure above 120 millimeters of mercury, diastolic blood pressure above 80 millimeters of mercury, smoking cigarettes, total cholesterol above 200 milligrams per deciliter or 5.2 millimoles per litre for those of us not in America, or diabetes. In other words, people didn't have to be diagnosed with any particular illness to be at risk of suffering a heart attack. They just had to have what is often considered normal for age levels of risk factors such as blood pressure. And on the other hand, individuals who did not have any of these risk factors had a 90% lower lifetime risk of coronary heart disease compared with the rest of the population. 90% lower. You could wipe out 90% of your risk of coronary heart disease just by keeping your blood pressure and cholesterol in lower ranges, avoiding smoking, and not getting diabetes, being physically active, those sorts of things. Significantly favourable lifestyle factors dramatically reduce the risk of coronary heart disease, even in people with an unfavourable genetic risk profile. So those who perhaps have a family history of early cardiac events, the father who had a massive heart attack at age 45, for instance, they benefit from favourable lifestyle factors as well. Now, I agree with Greenland's contention that individuals must take responsibility for their health behaviours, but his admonition needs to be set in a context. The medical profession has become the handmaiden of the pharmaceutical industry. Doctors enthusiastically spruik the drug companies' message that people can eat whatever they feel like. They can drink to excess, they can be physically inactive, they can ignore their needs for sleep and meaningful social interaction. And then, when their poor lifestyle choices eventually, inevitably, make them sick, the doctor will just dispense some magic pills to cure them, like the priest in the old days offering dispensation for your sins. Doctors need to stop acting as enablers for their patients' poor lifestyle habits and instead treat them as intelligent adults who are capable of understanding that today's behaviour choices shape tomorrow's health outcomes. Too often I've heard doctors say, "Oh, I could tell my patients to change their lifestyle, but they won't, so I don't even bother, I just write them a prescription." Now, the reality is that the critics of the new US blood pressure guidelines are right to worry about what doctors will actually do in response to these guidelines. The vast majority of the doctors who take the guidelines seriously, and that's not all of them, will whip out their prescription pads rather than talking to their patients about the danger that they're placing themselves in by following the diet and lifestyle practices that elevated their blood pressure in the first place, and then coaching them to change their habits. So it's going to be up to you, the consumer, to educate yourself about the risks and benefits of medical treatment for high blood pressure and to get informed about what you can do to improve your cardiovascular health. Now, to this end, I'm now offering my clients an extremely well-tested method for assessing arterial health, which gives you a heads up on your cardiovascular risk a good 10 years before the age at which blood pressure typically rises by measuring the degree of arterial stiffness. The SphymoCor device, which I've recently acquired, was developed at the University of New South Wales. Yay for us! Australian research has actually been developed by an Australian company rather than it going overseas for someone else to profit from it. And this SphymoCor device is now in use all over the world, including in my office. It's a quick, completely safe and non-invasive test which equips you to take control of your health destiny. And if you'd like to book an appointment to use this SphymoCor to assess your cardiovascular health, just contact me by email or phone, and my details are below the video. So thanks very much for your attention. I hope this has been interesting. Please do like the video, share it in your social networks, and I will catch up with you for next week's weekly update.